Welcome to the KR Films Entertainment channel. This movie opens up with a single woman who doesn't appear to be having the greatest of times, and by that I mean she's bloody, she's beaten, and she's giving birth to a baby, and our kids, those are the worst. And by giving birth to a baby I mean she essentially has it ripped out from her insides at the first sign of anything poking out down there, Jesus Christ. But that thing back after the baby is literally frosted into the world. We hear someone suffering from some clear breathing problems, like the dude could really benefit from a puff of an inhaler. He walks over to the woman, shouts die, and then proceeds to well die her, and that's why you shouldn't have kids. We see that this movie takes place 2 years after the events of the previous one, stating that after the events of that movie transpired, the army was sent in to conduct a search and destroy mission for about the area. But judging by what we've just seen in regards to babies being forcefully removed from birth canals, they missed a few, which does explain why they'd be kidnapping women and forcing them to breed. They're trying to regain their numbers after the search and destroy missions were supposedly a success. A new group has been sent out there to an old military bunker in one of the mines with the intention of installing some kind of electronic monitoring system. So of course that means that the mines are clearly inhabited by cave-dwelling people eating superhumans. Whoever goes in there isn't going to particularly yep, there it is. It isn't long before everyone outside of the mines gets targeted too, with this doctor bumping into this handsome looking fellow who appears to actually be trying to warn him before of course he finally gets murdered from behind. But hey, just like Ruby from the first movie, I guess not all of them subscribe to the ideology of napping, murdering and eating fellow humans. We then see this colonel receive a similar treatment by getting speed for the back and sent on a non-consenting base jump. Would then introduced to the main characters of the movie, this time trading unprepared ill-equipped civilians for unprepared ill-equipped military personnel. It's a group of National Guard trainees who don't appear to be particularly good at the job that they're training for, with the Royal be messing up a training exercise that would have seen 17 civilians and themselves killed. You know, the perfect bunch to deal with murderous superhumans during their training. They're tasked with dropping supplies off to the group who are currently exploring the monitoring system, clearly unaware that most of their insides have been well put on the outside. While they're driving through the desert, we learn that not only are these characters incompetent when it comes to actual combat situations, but they're also a bunch of hotheads. One poor taste your mama joke away from killing each other. The perfect people to be carrying around guns: Sarge, Napoleon, A. Mickey, Delma, Crank, Missy, Spitzer and Stump. Not like their names are particularly important, considering that they're essentially just fodder in a cannibalistic superhuman mounted men movie. One of the characters, Missy, is also in the second installment of the Wrong Turn franchise, where in that movie she also plays someone from the Military 2 movie. He's about mutated super strength cannibal men that share the same actor with a very similar role. It's like the Marvel connected a multiverse, but instead of superheroes and super villains, we've got super inbreeding cannibalistic villains. The group arrives at the site to discover that it's completely empty. They hear some unintelligible activity on the radio and notice somebody's up in the cliffs is using a signal mirror to get their attention. So given the circumstances of the group's task has now been changed to a search and rescue mission. Two trainees are told to stay back at base camp. Napoleon, yes, that's really his name, is to go to the toilet standing on one leg while holding his rifle in the air for daring to question the sergeant. Amber is to be in charge of communications, while the rest of the group is to head up into the hills, blissfully unaware as to what's waiting for them, mostly just rocks. Yeah, will submit murder to. I guess not long into the ascent, Mickey damages his ankle by almost falling into a mini shaft before being sent back down to base camp by Sergeant with Sojo to view. We see Napoleon deciding to enter the toilets to relieve himself, but as he sits down, a hand emerges from the toilet and grabs his leg, terrifying him. Now that's a shitty situation, God that was. But even for me, confused and honestly a little bit frightened, they pull the man from the toilet bowl. And side note, does anyone care to explain how a fully grown man I was able to fit in there? Is this a Mary Poppins handbag TARDIS-like situation going on here? Anyway, back to the poop man. While trying to clean the man up, they discover that from head to toe he's not only just covered in human feces but also cuts, which is a disaster sepsis cocktail in the making. And it seems like whoever did this to the man was perfectly aware of that, as none of his wounds seem serious enough to actually kill him on their own, meaning that the perpetrator of this crime clearly has some sort of deranged poop death fetish and wanted this man to die slowly and painfully. And right before he does die, he uttered the words, "There here man, what a crappy way to go. Okay, I'll stop now." Immediately after, they The vehicle that they arrived in burst into flames, destroying any equipment left on it, and with no communications to the outside world, their only way out of here. Before also noticing that both of their rifles have been taken, Amber, clearly alarmed by the dead toilet-dwelling man, decides to leave and to catch up with the others, while Napoleon decides against leaving and stays to continue trying the cons. He watches from the distance as out of nowhere someone appears from behind Amber and begins to attack her, and as he's sprinting towards her, Mickey, who was on his way back down the mountain, opens fire and hits the man before he quickly retreats into a hole in the ground, to which the shot man responds by grabbing Mickey's leg and forcing his body through a hole in the ground that is clearly too small to fit a body through, and absolutely mangling him in the process. Fiver up the mountain, Splitter and Crank are attacked and somehow finessed by a man throwing rocks and swinging a pickaxe around the place. In the process, Sarge walks around the corner to inspect the commotion and is accidentally shot in the confusion. Despite their best efforts to save him, ultimately it's too late to do anything, with Sarge being the only one who actually knew what he was doing, and the spare being fought at by rocks. They're all screwed. They're attempting to take Sarge his body back down the mountain, and they reach a point where they're forced to rappel down. Spitzer, feeling a little bit guilty about the whole killing science thing, volunteers to be the one to take him down, when all of a sudden you hear a scream followed by the thud of Splitter and Sarge, his body colliding with the floor. He looks like they took a short drop with a sudden stop. Confused as to how this could have happened, they pull the rope bike up to discover that it's been cut, and as they're distracted by Sputter's death, somebody slips in behind them and steals the rest of their ropes, leaving them stranded on the top of the cliff. They begin to search for another way down and stumble across the somehow still alive Colonel, who got launched from the cliff back in the beginning of the movie. He informs the group about the cannibals living in these mines, and he tells them that if they go in there, all of them but they women are going to be killed, who would be kept alive and forcefully used for reproduction. And it seems as he may have hit his head a little too hard after taking that dive off the cliff, as for no reason at all he decides to shoot himself. I'm not exactly sure as to why he did that, as he must have been sat there waiting for hours with that gun, and if he wanted to shoot himself he would have had plenty of time to do it. But the second people arrive who might actually stand a chance of getting him out of there, he decides now that's safer. Oh yeah, he had to deliver some important exposition, and now the movie's done with him. The group devise a plan to use Amber and Mrs. Bates in order to convince one of the mind dwellers to sneak up behind them, but before the potential kidnapping can do anything, the rest of the group appear and unload on the man. But right after making that relatively smart cool, Missy makes the opposite of a smart cool and decides to go off alone to relieve herself. And now I'm not so sure about you, but no matter how private of a person I may be, everybody's going to watch me urinate in a situation like this, because the last thing you want to do is because not when you're quite literally exposed and alone. And of course that's exactly what happens, as the rock behind her is in fact not a rock but a guy with very rock-like features that snatches her up and takes her off into the mines. The group follows her, screams into the entrance of the mine, but apparently Stump is afraid of the dark, as he decides to abandon everybody. In an effort to climb back down the side of the cliff without any rope, which goes about as well as you'd expect in a movie like this. As one is climbing down the cliff, a mutant appears, grabs his arm, slices itself off with ease and uses it to wave at him right before he plummets to the ground below, as the survivors of walking through the mine making the smart decision not to abandon each other, and like Stump, who now has a stump in place of an on Amber and Napoleon, a such through a hole which drops them to the floor below, separating them from Delma and Crank. Delma saves Crank from another hole because mines have a lot of am laying around the place, and after climbing down the hall we see Black with the rock ask Mutant's man who took Missy he's got some issues and a bit of a mummy cat. As he holds Missy down and refers to her his mama, to which she responds by spitting at him as you do before he then hits her and makes the strange decision to put his freakishly large tongue inside of her mouth, which is an incredibly dumb move to make on his part, as she bites it right off and makes a run for it, but unfortunately not before encountering this guy, who makes it clear that despite her best tongue removal efforts she isn't going to get out of here. He picks her up, takes her over to the table and begins to sexually assault her. Napoleon and Amber have an encounter with the now Tumblr's rock man as he launches Stump's severed arm at the pair before getting shot by Napoleon, who fires off random pot shots into the darkness before hitting him. After hitting him with his final bullet, he rushes it. Napoleon knocks him to the ground and attempts to kidnap Amber, but not before she makes like Slipknot and pushes her fingers into his eye, giving Napoleon enough time to come up behind the rock-like man and smash his brains in with. Well, rock be ironic that right after pulverizing that man's skull, Another one of the meat and centers wielding a gun, but he appears to have trouble with his vision, and after discovering the bloody pulp of the man's skull he begins to search for the killers. Not very well as he can't see, but a plus for effort I guess. The pair escape by falling through a hatch into another room where they then come face to face with the one mutant who attempted to warn the doctor in beginning. He puts his hands up to inform the pair that he's not a threat, making him different from the of a murderous inbreeding cannibalistic mounted man. He's a nice non-murderous cannibalistic mountain man. Delma and Crank then discover the dead meat, and before almost immediately being shot at by the blind one they return fire and take down the man, but not before Delma run for currently takes a bullet in the attack, but fortunately it appears to be non-lethal. They all them reunite, and after some understandable speculation as to whether or not they should trust the friendly one, he begins to lead them out of the mines, passing through rooms filled to the brim with clothes and shoes, being a stark reminder as to how long these mountains dwellers have been up to this and how many people they have truly killed, followed by them passing through a kitchen stroke slaughterhouse stacked with decapitated heads, 7 torsos, arms and legs, and literally every of a human body part that there is. They didn't discover Mickey's hacked up corpse, so mutilated in fact that it would be impossible to say which body parts belonged to him in the first place. Before noticing that Delma was actually lying about the severity of his bullet wounds, he was hit twice and that second shot would ultimately prove to be fatal. The three surviving members, Amber, Napoleon and Crank, are almost out of the cave system when Amber and Napoleon decide that they're not going to leave Missy behind. They decide to go back and try and find her. Crank stays behind and breaks his wage war room containing boxes of all dynamite, is static about hitting the jackpot and being able to defend himself. What he actually doesn't realize is that by taking the dynamite out of the room he's gone and activated a trap that causes the whole room to explode, killing both him and the friendly mutant that was potentially there. Only way out of there. And speaking of the friendly mutant, that character goes woefully underused in this. He kind of sets him up in a way where you think he might actually be a real help to these guys. Maybe he'll get into a fight and kill the big bad patriarch at the family, but nope, he's been blown to pieces. The moral of the story is don't ever try to help anyone, otherwise you'll explode. The good thing about the explosion is that it reveals an entrance into the military bunker back from the beginning of the movie, which happens to contain a door to the outside world, a bunker which is apparently terrible at withstanding exactly what it was built to withstand. They're attacked by someone pretending to be a mannequin in the bunker, but the pair are able to overpower him before repeatedly stabbing him with a bayonet. That in case you needed a few extra pockets in his jacket. They eventually come across the room the Missy is in and use a video playing from a phone to distract the man to get him away from the room, but as they're leaving with Missy, the man barges back into the room and begins to violently attack Missy. Man's crack really let himself go. Amber remembers that when all of this chaos began, she set aside a single bullet for herself just in case. She loads it into a gun, takes aim and shoots the man in the head. Mildly annoyed about the fact that his brains are leaking all over his shoes, he rushes at Amber and begins to strangle her. Napoleon then drives a spear for the man's body because apparently they just have them lying around out here in the mountains, and Amber begins to dig around in the hole in his head, pulling out chunks of his brain. But it would seem that this guy is the reincarnation of Jason Voorhees, because after falling to the floor presumably dead, he grabs Missy's leg and one final attempt to get her, to which she responds by taking a sledgehammer to his crown jewels that apparently aren't as resilient as his skull, as we hear them crunch when Napoleon then finish him off by plunging his bayonet right through the man's mouth and into the floor. And after the final threat as no dealt with, the pair grabbed Missy and walk right out of the front door, where they then live happily ever after and live long fulfilling lives. Except of course that's not how this happens, is just like the first movie, they need to wait for a sequel that in this case never came. When it comes to these Wrong Turn the Hills Have Eyes mutated cannibal movies, Vasenza be a little bit swell campy. Sure, this subject matter is quite disturbing when you think about it. The whole murdering and cannibalizing people thing tends to I'm off that way, but at least so far out of all of the other movies that have coverage that could fall under the genre, this one is undeniably been quite a bit darker, and in comparison to the Wrong Turn franchise, which this set of movies often gets compared to mostly by me, but still with the Wrong 2 movies tend to have far more of a silly wacky horror movie zone, where of the Hills Have Eyes of always seemed just ever so darker and bleak, with the sexual assault scene from the first movie and now the whole side plot about abducting women, forcefully impregnating them and immediately murdering them once they give birth to their babies. Thus just it's just that ever so much more twisted than the other movies, and in all honesty pays off for its show. There's no sequel to this, so maybe it didn't quite do as well as people would have hoped, but with its darker approach it certainly does feel a little bit different from the other movies within its same genre. Hell, I'll take anything that can separate it from the pure schlock that the Wrong Turn franchise would later go on to produce.